Good afternoon, my friends. The timing of this offseason could not be working out much better for the Detroit Lions, and the latest developments involving both the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers should absolutely catch the attention of every Lions fan. As we get closer to training camp, everyone starts looking back at what each team actually accomplished over the past few months instead of simply reacting to headlines. When you step back and compare the moves across the NFC North, something begins to stand out very clearly. While many people spent months talking about excitement surrounding the Bears, or assuming the Packers would simply reload again, the reality may be very different. Take the Bears first. For months, there has been so much discussion surrounding Ben Johnson joining Chicago and what that could mean for Caleb Williams. Those are exciting storylines, and nobody is denying that Ben Johnson proved himself to be one of football's best offensive minds during his time in Detroit. But coaching alone doesn't erase everything that happened to the roster this offseason. When you actually examine what changed, it feels like the Bears watched more proven talent leave than arrive. That's something that deserves attention, because winning in the NFL isn't just about having an exciting coach or a promising quarterback. It's about putting enough quality players around them to make everything function consistently over an entire season. One position that immediately jumps out is center. Lions fans don't need anyone to explain how important that position is. Detroit experienced firsthand just how difficult life becomes after losing Frank Ragnow. Even if everyone tried convincing themselves things would eventually be fine, replacing an elite center is never simple. Offensive lines depend on chemistry, communication, leadership, and experience, and those qualities don't magically appear overnight. Looking at Chicago's situation, it's impossible not to think about that lesson. Losing stability in the middle of the offensive line creates challenges that don't always show up in offseason headlines, but become painfully obvious once games begin. Quarterbacks feel more pressure, running lanes disappear faster, and offensive rhythm becomes much harder to establish. Then there's the rest of the roster movement. Looking at who arrived, there simply aren't many additions that immediately make you stop and think this team suddenly became dramatically stronger. Garrett Bradbury doesn't exactly arrive with overwhelming momentum. Logan Jones is still developing. Devin Bush brings experience, while Tyheim Thieneman provides another option, and Kobe Bryant is a respectable addition, but none of those names completely transform how opponents prepare for the Bears. That's why the offseason hype deserves another look. It's easy to become fascinated by coaching changes, but football games are still won by players making plays every Sunday. Another interesting discussion coming out of the Lions community centers around the offense itself. One question has started generating plenty of debate. Who will finish the 2026 season with more receiving yards, Tez Johnson or Jahmyr Gibbs? At first, it sounds like a surprisingly difficult question, but when you think about Gibbs' explosiveness, it's easy to understand why many people lean in his direction. Every time he touches the football, it feels like there's potential for a huge gain. He doesn't need 10 catches to make an impact. Sometimes 2 or 3 well-designed touches completely change a football game. Screen passes especially become an interesting topic when discussing Gibbs' role this season. There's hope that Detroit will continue finding creative ways to get the ball into his hands quickly. A simple screen can suddenly become a 30-yard or even 40-yard gain because of his acceleration, vision, and ability to make defenders miss in space. It almost feels like screenplays operate at 2 extremes. Either they're completely shut down before they develop, or they become some of the most explosive plays in an offense. With a player like Gibbs, the potential reward is enormous every single time. Now shift over to Green Bay. The Packers have consistently found ways to remain competitive, and nobody should ever underestimate them simply because of the logo on the helmet. They've earned that respect over many years. But when evaluating this particular offseason, there are legitimate reasons why Lions fans should feel optimistic. One of the biggest factors isn't just player movement, it's also what happened on the coaching staff. Detroit experienced something similar not long ago. Losing Ben Johnson wasn't just losing another assistant coach, he was an elite offensive coordinator whose creativity elevated the offense. Many people believed everything would simply continue because Jared Goff was still under center and the roster remained talented. The Lions still managed to produce offensively, but everyone also saw that replacing an elite coordinator isn't automatic. Continuity matters, scheme matters, leadership matters. Now Green Bay faces its own adjustments after losing coordinators, and that's never something teams can casually dismiss. New voices bring new systems, different philosophies, and an entirely new learning process. On top of that, the Packers also saw major changes on the defensive side. Looking strictly at the defensive personnel discussed, losing players like Micah Parsons, Rashawn Gary, and Key Walker dramatically changes the conversation. Those aren't depth pieces, those are impact players capable of changing games. Yes, additions arrived as well. Javon Hargrave brings veteran experience, but he's now 33 years old. Christian Watson received an extension, while Reed remains another piece of the puzzle, but those moves don't necessarily erase the impact created by losing high-level defensive talent. For Detroit, that's encouraging, because divisional games often come down to small differences. Nobody is asking opponents to become terrible overnight. But if direct rivals become even slightly weaker while the Lions maintain a competitive roster, that shifts the balance inside the NFC North. There's another major storyline Lions fans continue discussing involving the secondary. With Terry and Arnold no longer part of the picture, attention naturally shifts toward DJ Reed. Whether anyone likes it or not, Reed becomes one of the most important defensive players entering the season. Detroit invested significantly by signing him to a 3-year, $48 million contract because the organization believed he could replace Carlton Davis at a high level. The good news is that his recent struggles weren't necessarily about losing his ability as a cornerback. Reed himself explained that after the injury, he noticed the difference while watching film. Earlier in the year, he felt more explosive, more confident, and capable of matching receivers stride for stride. Later in the season, despite using the same techniques, he simply didn't have that extra burst that normally defines his game. That's actually encouraging because it suggests the issue wasn't forgotten fundamentals or declining instincts. It was health. If Reed returns fully healthy, Detroit could be getting the version of the player they originally expected when they signed him. And if Reed performs at that level while Ennis Rakestraw Jr. develops into a dependable contributor, suddenly the Lions secondary begins looking much stronger than many people currently assume. One additional detail that stands out is Reed's leadership. Rather than simply preparing individually, he organized a film session at his house, inviting teammates together to study, eat, and continue building chemistry before training camp even begins. Those kinds of moments rarely dominate headlines, but they often reveal the culture inside a locker room. Leadership isn't only demonstrated during games. Sometimes it's built during quiet off-season gatherings that strengthen communication and trust before the season even starts. With training camp getting closer, these developments make the overall picture much more interesting than many people expected just a few weeks ago. Instead of focusing only on off-season hype surrounding division rivals, perhaps the bigger story is that Detroit may quietly be entering this next phase with fewer unanswered questions than both Chicago and Green Bay. But does that automatically make the Lions the clear favorite in the NFC North, or do you think there's still one major concern Detroit needs to solve before the regular season begins? One thing that also shouldn't be overlooked is how much the success of this defense now depends on players simply staying available. Last season showed everyone that talent alone isn't enough if injuries begin piling up. That's exactly why DJ Reed's comments about his own season matter so much. He wasn't making excuses. He was giving a very honest evaluation of what happened physically. He admitted that when he watched his own film, he could clearly see the difference between the player he was before the injury and the player he became afterward. His technique hadn't changed. His understanding of coverage hadn't changed. What disappeared was that extra burst that allowed him to stay attached to receivers and recover when plays extended. For Lions fans, that's actually a reason to be optimistic rather than concerned. If health was the biggest issue, then a fully recovered Reed has every opportunity to return to the level that made Detroit invest heavily in him. The organization didn't sign him by accident. They believed he was one of the better cornerbacks available, someone capable of handling difficult assignments every single week. That belief hasn't disappeared simply because one injury interrupted his season. At the same time, the Lions don't need Reed to carry the entire secondary by himself. That's where the development of Ennis Rakestraw Jr. becomes incredibly important. Detroit continues believing in his potential, and if he becomes the reliable contributor many expected when he entered the league, suddenly the secondary starts looking much deeper than many national analysts currently give it credit for. Instead of asking one player to solve every problem, the Lions could field a defensive backfield where multiple players are capable of making plays. That changes everything. Defensive coordinators become much more flexible when they trust several corners instead of constantly constantly protecting one position. Another encouraging sign is that Reed already appears focused on building chemistry before training camp officially begins. Reports of him inviting teammates over for film study and spending time together away from the facility might seem like a small detail, but those moments often create stronger communication once the season starts. Great defenses rarely become great overnight. They develop trust through repetition, preparation, and leadership. Having veterans take that initiative sends a positive message throughout the locker room. Younger players see what professionalism looks like. They see experienced veterans putting in extra work instead of waiting for coaches to organize everything. That type of culture has been one of the biggest strengths of this Lions team over the past few seasons. Meanwhile, when looking back around the division, it becomes even easier to appreciate where Detroit currently stands. Chicago enters the season with enormous expectations because of the excitement surrounding Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams. Green Bay will once again expect to compete because that's what the Packers have consistently done over the years. But expectations don't automatically translate into victories. Every offseason creates winners on paper. Every fan base convinces itself that new additions will immediately solve old problems. Then September arrives and reality begins separating hype from execution. Detroit has already lived through many of those lessons. The Lions know what it feels like to lose elite coordinators. They know what it feels like to lose cornerstone players along the offensive line. They know how quickly injuries can force adjustments throughout the roster. Because they've already experienced those situations, perhaps they're actually better prepared than people realize for whatever challenges arrive this season. That's one of the biggest reasons why looking only at flashy offseason headlines can become misleading. Championships aren't won in March or April. They're built through preparation, leadership, chemistry, and having enough quality players ready when adversity inevitably arrives. There's also another reason Lions fans should appreciate what's happening inside the division. Every weakness that appears on a rival's roster potentially creates opportunities for Detroit. If Chicago's offensive line struggles to adjust after significant changes, that's good news for the Lions' pass rush. If Green Bay's defense takes time replacing major contributors while also adapting to coaching changes, that's another opportunity Detroit has to take advantage of divisional matchups. None of this guarantees anything once the season begins. The NFL has a way of surprising everyone every single year. Teams expected to dominate sometimes disappoint, while overlooked teams suddenly become contenders. But based strictly on everything discussed here, it's understandable why